What's up, guys? We got a Tuesday version. We had Monday yesterday. We have a Tuesday version today with none other than himself, Chris Gebhardt. Welcome to the pod. This is your first time on Top Corner. Tell us about yourself. Where can they find you? Go ahead.
Well, first off, thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it. It's nice to be on and talk a little soccer with you, and I'm looking forward to our conversation coming up. For those of you who may not know, I run a website called STLsoccernews.com, which basically started off as an aggregator of podcasts here in the St. Louis area. When City was getting ready to get started, I was interested in finding and kind of compiling all of the different podcasts. I'm a content junkie, so I listen to pods and vids and all that kind of stuff. And as I started putting together a list, I was like, you know what, if I'm doing this, maybe somebody else would find this useful, to have a list somewhere that I could put somewhere. And so I just started a real quick, simple website, stuck all the podcasts on it from St. Louis, and put it out there and said, hey, if anybody else finds this useful to connect with content, here you go. And it turned into kind of snowballed from there. As more people started to use it, more people started to say, hey, why don't you have this on there or that on there? And so it's really turned into just a resource that I maintain to help people find stuff a little bit more easily. If it does help somebody connect with a podcast they like to listen to, or find an article about soccer that they want to read, or connect with a content creator, or find a game they might want to go watch, great. That's all it's there to do. And I think hopefully people find it useful. So,
yeah.
Chris, I can tell you, I really, really appreciate your site. That's before I even started getting into this kind of content creator space. It was the way that I started learning about all of the podcasts that are out there covering City. But it's even more than just the pods, right? You've got, I think, Will Bramlett, some of the photographers that are on there, where you can catch their work and really see just a myriad of content of all platforms. And one of the biggest things I love about your site is you have resources and links for other teams. So you can go on, if you're a sicko like I am, and find podcasts from the other teams talking about previewing upcoming games, like Happy Foot, Sad Foot out in LAFC land. If it's just one example, right? Like, so I truly appreciate the work you put in, man, because it's just a fantastic resource, as you said.
Thank you. I very much appreciate that. Yeah. The whole point behind the featuring of other teams' podcasts, and I have links out to basically pods from and content creators from every club, and the whole point was to try to encourage collaborations. I was very nicely asked to be on the Battered MLS show several months ago, and I've been on a few times with them now, and it's one guy from like 3 or 4 clubs, and you're all together and you're talking about your team and you're learning about other people's teams. And it's really interesting. And the more I kind of looked at that, I said, this is something that if I can help facilitate collaborations between not only the St. Louis podcasters and other cities, but, I've had people reach out from Austin and Houston and Seattle saying, yeah, we go to your site to find people from, that aren't even playing in city. And it's great. And so, yeah, I mean, it's something that is not a big deal for me, because I think it's, and one of the things that I always like to say is that, unlike most other sports in North America, soccer is kind of reliant on fan-created content, because it's never going to have the media draw that, American football has, or baseball, or NBA, or NHL. So it relies a lot more on podcasts and freelance writers and that kind of stuff, right? It's fan-driven content. That's so important. And so, with that and being part of, helping support people who create stuff like you guys, that's selfish for me, because it gives me more stuff to consume. It gives me content, right? And it gives me stuff to read and to listen to. And so, one of the things that we're so blessed to have here is such a gigantic podcast and content creator community, right? We're over 20 podcasts. We have all kinds of great writers, and like you said, photographers and other people that create soccer content. And my goal is to keep encouraging those people to put in the work, to make content for the rest of us, right? And it shouldn't really matter if you're going out to 10 people, 100 people, or 1,000 people, if you're passionate about what you're doing, then I want those people who are passionate about making that stuff to at least know there's somebody out there who's trying to support them. And that's really what the goal of the website is. And that's what I try to do. And occasionally somebody will ask me to come on and chat soccer, and I love doing that. But I'm always happy to refer other people. I get requests a lot from out of town pods saying, hey, would you recommend somebody to have on? And my running joke is anytime anybody asks me to do it, it's like, well, Matt Baker must be busy. I'll be the JV squad and I'll come in. Right.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of times where I'll have people reach out to me and say, hey, who would you recommend? Who might be good? And I like to connect people like that. And it's really helpful for our community of creators and also other people in other clubs. So,
not only do you have the website, you're also running a charity event. You've been doing it. I know this season is the first time I'm competing in it, but have you been doing it for multiple years? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So the charity challenge is kind of a cool thing that started last year. And really what it was just an excuse to find some new charity for me to donate money to. I like to give something, around the end of the year, anyways. And I thought, why not have something that, kind of runs all season and allows the content creators to kind of compete against each other in a friendly way. Because that's the other thing too, is one of the things that's nice about having so many podcasters and content creators is all you guys seem to get along, and that's not necessarily the case in other cities. There's some competition that isn't necessarily all that nice, for listeners or viewers or whatever. And here everybody seems to get along. Everybody, kind of respects everybody. And so the way that, the charity event runs, essentially, I'm not asking anybody to put themselves out there to pick against City. You're just guessing how many goals that City's going to score in each individual MLS game. So you're not going on record picking against them. You're just guessing how many times they're going to score in a game. And obviously this year it's been not as fun with all the scoreless draws, or the scoreless appearances from City, but hopefully that improves. But the charity challenge is really cool. And there's been some other things, our friends that at the City Refs have put on a couple events that brings everybody together in the content community. And they try to do a similar thing where they get everybody together to raise money. I just, whatever I can do to foster kind of that camaraderie between the different content communities and also let people, meet or talk or, friendly, banner is always helpful for everybody. So, yeah.
Yeah. So we talked yesterday, was a long episode about a lot of the shortcomings recently for St. Louis City SC. Many people were expecting a press release talking about a new head coach come Monday morning. Of course, Olaf Melberg's still the head coach of St. Louis City SC. A lot of fans upset still. The team winless in their last 10. They'll be playing in what most people assume to be almost Minnesota's second squad tomorrow night in the U.S. Open Cup. We talked about it a little bit on the podcast and a little bit of predictions, but we didn't hear, of course, Chris, just a little bit about the Open Cup and then also the game itself for City tomorrow night versus Minnesota.
Sure. Well, and you guys kind of told me that you wanted me to dive a little bit into the Open Cup, and I'm always happy to do that. And so for those who are either, not aware of what the Open Cup is or why it's meaningful to St. Louis, basically it is our country's national tournament. It is the equivalent in soccer of the U.S. Open in golf or the U.S. Open in tennis, where anybody can enter, anybody theoretically could win it. It's a tournament that's over 100 years old. It originally was known as the National Challenge Cup, which eventually got kind of revised and changed into the U.S. Open Cup. But it's the same structure. It's the same entity that it's always been. The reason why it's important and why it should be important to St. Louis soccer fans in particular is not only the fact of the success that we've had in the tournament as a city and as a soccer city in winning 10 Open Cups. It's not necessarily that. It's also the fact that the growth of St. Louis soccer has gone hand in hand with their success in the Open Cup. Back when soccer was just getting organized as a sport in the United States, right around the turn of the century, to 1900, there was interest in the sport. And in fact, there was a game that drew over 10,000 people in 1903 here in St. Louis, but what happened is when you started to have these regional soccer leagues, and St. Louis has had many, many, many soccer leagues over the years, and especially in the early, first half of the last century, those regional leagues really only played against each other, right? And so you'd have 4 or 5 or 6 teams from St. Louis, and they would play in a league, and that would be it. Well, the rise of the U.S. Open Cup and the amateur, the National Amateur Cup as well, but more so the U.S. Open Cup, really what it did was allow regions to play against each other for the first time. And so you wind up seeing, St. Louis play against Chicago teams and Pennsylvania teams and New York and the Northeast. And at the time in the 20s and 30s, soccer was kind of in the same infancy, but slightly a step behind baseball. Baseball really kind of started to hit its stride in the 20s. Everybody talks about the 27 Yankees, and so baseball really had started to grab the attention of the country. Soccer was a little bit behind it as far as getting attention, as far as getting an audience, and in particular, especially here in St. Louis, a lot of the baseball players played soccer in the off season. So it was a way for them to stay in shape. It was a way for them to stay active. These are guys that are competitive athletes. They wanted something to do. So a lot of the guys who were, on those U.S. Open Cup winning teams of the 20s and 30s are baseball players, basically who are doing this as a kind of a side project, right? Something to do on the side. And so really, as the success of St. Louis spawned, in the U.S. Open Cup, what it did was not only put St. Louis on a map as a destination that was one of the epicenters of soccer, especially in the early part of the last century, 20th century, but it also moved the focus away from the Northeast, where it traditionally had just been about New York and Massachusetts and kind of that Northeast corridor of soccer. And so for a long time, for many, many decades, St. Louis was like the westernmost outpost of soccer. Chicago to a lesser extent, but really St. Louis, and also that goes hand in hand with the success that we had in that tournament, because what it did was teams from here would win, which would inspire kids or younger people to play the game, which then created better players, which created more success, which led to more winners, and it fed on itself, right? And so it just started to snowball. And so when you talk about the original winners of the U.S. Open Cup from St. Louis, it was a team called Ben Miller's. And Ben Miller's, and back then, most of the teams were pure sponsored by, some local business, right? So Ben Miller's was a hat company. Famously, their slogan was "Ben Miller's, we want your head." And so they just made hats, and they sponsored this team that was a massive, massive underdog in the Cup final. They wound up winning, and that was a wake-up call to especially the Northeast that, oh, okay, yeah, St. Louis does, can produce, very high-level soccer players for the time. And then as you go through the history and the timeline, and I'm not going to go through all 10 of them because, that would take more than the time that we had tonight. It'd probably be multiple shows to do that. But you can look at the kind of era between the 30s and the 50s. And when you start to get into the Sticks Fair and Fuller teams of the 30s, clubs that were going to, back to back to back, U.S. Open Cup finals, winning them, winning several of them. And then you get into the, like the 33, 34 team back to back for Sticks. And then 35, they won it again as Central Breweries. So, 3 straight champions. You have guys on those teams that were going and playing on the national team and becoming recognized nationally as high-level players. It really helped cement the status of the game here in St. Louis. And one of the things that was really interesting is early on, everybody thinks of the 1950 World Cup team, the Boys from the Hill, right? Everybody thinks that was the big moment in St. Louis soccer, and it is, right? There's no denying that it is. However, the Italians from the Hill that made up a bulk of that team, that's not the European influence that first really started soccer here. It was mostly Scots and Irish coming over to work in the, in steel mills and things like that in the early part of the century. And so really where soccer originated in St. Louis was from the Scotch and Irish and not so much from the Italians, and then, you can look in each basically time frame and say, okay, here's the immigrant population that influenced soccer during that era. Right. And so, in the beginning, it was Scotch and Irish. Once you got into the 30s, 40s, 50s, it was the Italians. Once you got into, later on, obviously we have a big Bosnian population now, and that's influenced people, from the 80s, 90s, so, soccer here is definitely a part of the melting pot of America, and also the part of the melting pot of St. Louis. And so, each generation has kind of had their own influence, right? Go ahead, Jeremy, sir.
Oh, no. So you bring up just kind of the way the game started, right? In the early 1900s and the kind of blue collar effort behind getting that those early foundations in the game in town. And it's never ceases to amaze me, because that's the roots that start it, but that's the same kind of players that we consistently want to have on our team, right? Those blue collar, hard nosed, we'll leave it all out on the pitch grinder guys. And that parallel's just always striking to me.
Yeah. St. Louis, especially back then, there was two kind of very recognizable styles of play. You had the Northeast style, which was, and this is, so let me call timeout on this for a second. Anybody who has any interest at all in St. Louis soccer needs to get their hands on Dave Lang's book, Soccer Made in St. Louis, period. It is the Bible of St. Louis soccer. A lot of knowledge that I'm passing along tonight comes directly from having read that book, many, many times. It also has a foreword from Mr. Soccer himself, Bill McDermott. We are so blessed here in St. Louis to have two of the best soccer writers ever in this country in St. Louis, in Dave Lang and Bill McDermott. If you have not read Soccer Made in St. Louis, find a copy, get a copy, do whatever you got to do to get your hands on it. So Dave Lang describes the style of St. Louis soccer in the early part of the 20th century as generously described as physical. So what that means is they were dirty as hell, and they would play to that line of dirty and then go over that line. And so you had a very possession stylistic, skill-based style coming out of the Northeast, and you had the rough and tumble, direct, physical, beat you up, style of St. Louis. And then also they were big on long passes. So it was a lot of like physical defense with hitting you over the top. Right. And so, and there's a lot of that has still carried through today. Right. St. Louis, especially high school teams in this area, have a reputation for playing physical. The teams that have come out of this area are generally recognized as being more physical than their counterparts in California or in the southern United States or the Northeast. Like, this is just the style that we play, and that's something that you can talk to guys like a Taylor Twellman or Ty Keogh or anybody, the living St. Louis soccer legends, and they will, to a man, say that the style of St. Louis soccer is that of physicality and of hard-nosed players. So you're definitely right. Yeah. And so the thing about St. Louis soccer is that, we're big on familial dynasties here. You have the Keoghs and you have, these families, the Twellmans that are well known in the area and have contributed so much to soccer in St. Louis. And that goes, that's tied into the Open Cup as well. Cutis, who is the funeral home chain or the funeral home in St. Louis, they were the sponsor of multiple U.S. Open Cup winners here in St. Louis. And they had the Eppies. The Eppies were a father-son that won it 29 years apart from each other. And so, there are these family links to the tournament. And the 48 team that won it is probably, if not the greatest semblance of St. Louis soccer talent ever. It's right there. It's something that, it's the legendary St. Louis Simpkins Ford team in 1948 that had basically half a dozen guys on it that went on to play on the 1950 World Cup team, and the boys from the Hill. So, you're rolling out half your national team on a U.S. Open Cup squad, at the time, which is really, really impressive. And also you hear some of the stories that come out of that time frame where, clubs, all the clubs from St. Louis sat out in 1949 because of a travel dispute at the end of the 1948 tournament, which basically Simpkins had agreed to pay for the Brooklyn team to come down here by train, and Brooklyn insisted on flying. And then basically once the tournament was over, all the St. Louis teams banded together and said, well, we're boycotting the next year. And so they wound up boycotting, and then in 50, they wound up winning it. They won it in 48, skipped 49, and then won it in 50. Right. So, yeah, I mean, the Open Cup has such a legendary history here, and it's so important, but what it really means and what it, why it matters to a lot of us, and not everybody. And I understand that. Right. And I said this on a different show a couple weeks ago, that you can be a City fan, and there's nothing wrong with being a City fan. And I love the fact that we have all these City fans who kind of only care about the MLS, and they only really have started caring about it since 2023 or maybe 22 when we got a team. And there's nothing wrong with that. And if we fill a stadium with nothing but City fans, perfectly fine. More the merrier. But to be a St. Louis soccer fan is to be interested in and care about and respect more than just City and more than just the MLS. It's about caring about and having interest in all of our soccer history, including the Open Cup, including all the success that SLU has had, and SIUE, and all the college programs that we have here. And the women's game, St. Louis always gets kind of underrated when it comes to our contribution to the women's game. We have all these U.S. women's team players that have come from here, but also the very first women's league in the country started here. The Craig League started in 1950, right? And so, all of that goes into being a St. Louis soccer fan. And so if I can take somebody from being a MLS fan and / City fan and turn them into a St. Louis soccer fan where they have more of an appreciation of the history, and they'll go out and watch a semi-pro game. I was at one Saturday, or a local college game, right? The more we can support soccer at all levels, the better soccer becomes. And that feeds into kind of the mission statement of the U.S. Open Cup, which is supporting soccer at all levels. We don't have promotion and relegation in this country. We don't have a true pyramid. And we're not going to get into that because that would be another 2-hour episode about the whole pro rel thing. And I'm not I'm not a diehard crazy pro rel person. I respect pro rel. I don't know if it would work here, so I'm not one of these people who would insist on it. And because there is that faction in this country that believes you're not allowed to enjoy soccer at all because we don't have pro rel, and I completely disagree with that attitude.
Yeah.
Right? But the fact that we don't have pro rel means that this is the one and only opportunity for small clubs to get a chance to play big clubs. This is it. This is their only opportunity every year. So that should be supported. And obviously, the MLS is doing their best to not support that, and not support, the Open Cup. And we can get into that. But, the responsibility for, I think, those of us in the St. Louis area anyways, who are fans of the game and fans of the history of the game, is to maintain or make sure that people understand why we care about it. I'm not insisting that anybody cares about it. I'm not going to gatekeep and say, well, if you don't care about the Open Cup, you're not a real soccer fan. That's not what anybody should say. And that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that there should at least be an appreciation for why it matters. And there should be an appreciation of why it means so much to those of us that do care so much about it and want it to be right up there with the rest of the history of the game in this town, other than just City. So,
yeah.
So, Chris, question for you then. And, I'm with you. I care about this tournament. We've talked several times on Luligan Street about even 3 years ago, I didn't know what it was. Now I do, and I'm in it, right? Yeah. But I always compare this kind of to the FA Cup or to the Copa del Rey or the Copa Italia, those European Cup competitions. You mentioned right there that we don't have that true soccer pyramid. Do you think that the disparity in talent levels hurts this tournament grow? Just like honest opinion, because we've got one lower league team left right now. If you look at the bracket in the round of 16, do you think that that's part of the problem with MLS not supporting it is because the pyramid isn't ready? Is that too messy?
Well, no, MLS doesn't. It was funny because, last year when MLS decided to kind of pull teams out of it, the excuses were, oh, well, the field qualities on these lower level teams is bad and there's schedule congestion. And that was the two biggies. And to both of those, I would have liked to tell Don Garber, you've got an MLS team that plays on a baseball diamond. You've got another one that plays on some god-awful turf in Vancouver that I've joked with some Vancouver podcast guys, and they're like, yeah, it's like bad carpeting, right? And and wait till people see what the turf in San Diego is going to be like when San Diego State football season starts, because that turf's already bad, and it was bad before City even played there. Wait till football season starts. So don't talk to me about what your field conditions are like, because MLS hasn't figured that out for all their clubs yet, right?
Nope.
Now, on the other side, the schedule congestion. That's a problem they created themselves when they started their own tournament with League MX and called it Leagues Cup, right? And
Cash
so,
Grab Cup.
yeah, and so that was a self-made problem where you're adding more games and then you're saying we have too many games. That's not a valid reason.
No.
So that was 2 years. That was last year. This year, they basically kind of dropped the charade and came out and said, well, we don't control the U.S. Open Cup. We don't really make any money off of it. So that's why we're not really into doing it, and so it was a shocking bit of honesty, even though we all knew that's what the reason was anyways.
Yeah.
But they're doing what they feel is best for MLS, right? Which does not sync up with doing what's best for soccer overall in this country. But MLS and MLS kind of apologists can look at it and say, well, that's not their responsibility. They're trying to run a business. They're trying to do what's best for MLS. Yeah. And so the issue is that the people who are responsible for growing the game in the country, i.e. the U.S. Soccer Federation, are the ones who are not enforcing their own rule, which is that all League Tier 1, teams are required to play in the Open Cup. So, it struck me, as odd today, unfortunate that, and I made a comment on social media about it, that they're opening up this secondary transfer window for the conference, for the CONCACAF Champions Cup clubs, right?
Yep.
And whether you agree with doing that or not agreeing with doing that, they're taking advantage of this secondary window that they're being granted, and they're changing their own transfer window rules, which means that they have the capability of changing their own rules anytime they want to, but they won't do it in the sense of being able to expand rosters and open them up for next pro teams to compete for their primary clubs in the Open Cup, because that would fix all the problems, right? Because if you just said, okay, for the purpose of Open Cup, you can bring up anybody you want from your next pro club or your affiliated team, because some teams don't have a next pro club, but you bring up anybody you want, throw your jersey on them and say, okay, that's our roster. That would fix the problem, because then you would allow every team to compete. No one would give a crap really where, that these guys are next pro players, because they're wearing the correct jersey, they're representing their club. Right. And so, yes, the MLS is not doing enough to foster and support soccer in this country, but from their perspective, it's not their responsibility to do that. And it's unfortunate.
Well, it's funny that they took like a half step towards that by saying, oh, well, you can call up a player and cup games don't count against their count in games, right? So it's like they took a half step, but not the full step. And that always baffles me. I guess the thing I want to know too, and Charlie, feel free to jump into the conversation. I apologize if I'm dominating it, but I asked Olaf earlier in the year, for the prize for winning is $600,000. And that's great. It's a nice little bit of money. But then you get a spot in the CONCACAF Champions Cup, right? So that to me is huge, because if somehow you win that, you then open up to the Club World Cup. And I'm not saying we're going to go win the Club World Cup. So just be reeling, we're not. But to me, that's eyes on your club. That's more revenue for your team. I don't know why it's not something that gets viewed as taken more seriously. I mean, I look at the clubs in Europe, and like you were just laying out, they'll call up academy players for the early round games. Your early tournament round games is your youth, and it gives you a chance to assess them, your first team staff to assess their development even more. So it seems like it's a win-win-win across the board. I just don't understand why there can't be, like, why am I the only one, or at least not maybe in this conversation, but as a fan, small population, looking at it this way?
Yeah. I mean, the way that they've shaped it so far, and even the way that they've shaped the roster constructions, it feels like they don't want the homegrowns to play. I don't know. It feels like, of course, they can spout all they want with wanting that player development, with the lack of times you can bring up a player and then not use them, especially in City's cases, where you brought them up to train with the first team for a week and then just wasted one of their 3 and not play them at all. But like, I don't know, it feels as though they are not introducing that part of youth. And imagine a story. I know that, I mean, the kid in Philly, Sullivan, I mean, he will be, I mean, he's on track to be an amazing player, right? In Europe. He's already got a deal with, like, I think Man City lined up for when he's 18. But imagine the amount of press that you would get from a kid from the MLS going to Europe and being a superstar, right? You would think that you would want to have a little bit more recognition from your youth in that sense, but it feels like they're not, in a way.
Well, and if you look at the tournament bracket, like going back a couple rounds, I think it was Tom Franklin, Soccer Zombie, went to one of the Des Moines Menace games. Like, I know that team had a lot of retired professionals on it, right? But if you think about it, that team, if one of those level teams gets through all the way to the semifinal, just say that, and you get that huge cup set going all the way through, how much exposure does that do to your point earlier, Chris, about tying these, exposing this game and tying this all to the ultimate goal, which is growing the game in the country and helping us develop, more talent to the level of a Christian Pulisic, a Weston McKennie, and that level on the national team, because we need that. And we need to get that pipeline stopped.
And the MLS knows that. And they said, well, I think the Leagues Cup will make us get more exposure, and not even exposure, but when they say exposure, they mean moolah in that kind of sense. But I mean, it's odd the way that kind of worked out last year, especially with City not participating via rule, like them wanting to participate and not being able to in that sense. And a lot of fans wanting it, and a lot of stuff that if we get into it, it'll be a 4-hour episode. But I mean, just regarding, if you want, Jeremy, go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead, Charlie.
Just regarding the game tomorrow, Chris, what amount of importance do you put on this game, not only for the coaching situation but for the team?
Well, and actually, before we get into that, there was one more comment I wanted to make on the Open Cup in general.
Yeah,
so
of course.
Just
sorry.
Sorry. So one of the things that is a common argument or a common thing that I hear from people who don't necessarily enjoy the Open Cup or they don't care about it. There's a vocal group of people that, kind of outspoken that we don't care about this. Why do we care about playing, lower level teams? No one cares. The fans of those teams care flat out. Right. And so, yes, you may not care specifically because you only care about City. But the fans of those teams get an opportunity, especially USL sides, to come to see our shiny new stadium, right? They get a chance to come see a bigger club, and so it matters to those fans. Don't say that it doesn't matter. It may not matter to you individually, but there's a lot of people that it does matter for, and those fans of the smaller clubs, it obviously does matter, and also the US Open Cup is by its nature, especially in the early rounds, fun, right? Cup sets are fun. Watching teams like El Farolito is fun, right? The Burrito Boys from last year, right? Watching Sharktopus, like some of these clubs, it's like, yeah, they're silly, but it's also fun. It doesn't always have to be about just financial dollars and cents. And the other thing as well is, you think about people who are like, well, the Open Cup and St. Louis, and we hear this from our neighbors to the west sometimes, you guys are stuck in the past and you don't, that stuff was all 50, 60, 80, 100 years ago. That has nothing to do with modern soccer, right? Well, go talk to any of the old school Lilligans about the memories they made with St. Louis FC, and the biggest memory they have as a club is an Open Cup memory. It's Sam Fink's goal against against FC Cincinnati. In the same year that they beat the Chicago Fire and FC Cincinnati in the Open Cup. So, and that was 6 years ago. So the Open Cup does have modern, meaningfulness, right? It does matter now. It's not just about stuff that happened 80, 90 years ago, right? It's still making memories. And that's something that, with this club itself, when you look at, and we'll talk a little bit about, tomorrow's game. this is probably their only opportunity to do anything meaningful in this season, right? Because the MLS, the dream of the MLS playoffs is evaporating quickly, right? You know, and that is kind of going out the window rapidly as each game ticks by. We're through 14 games now, and they're not sniffing the playoffs, you know, if things continue as is. So this might be the only thing that they have to play for that's meaningful this year. And so, you know, yeah, they should take it seriously. And Minnesota, on the other hand, you know, with where they are with their club and what they're doing, yeah, it wouldn't surprise me at all if they roll out a rotated lineup, you know, a very heavily rotated lineup. Especially, they have to think that, yeah, they might beat us with a rotated lineup based on how we played Saturday, right? But from St. Louis's perspective, we should see, if not all starters, then, you know, 9 or 10, and maybe you throw a Zielinski in there, maybe a Mackay Joyner, but like I would strongly anticipate seeing 8 or 9 regulars. Like I don't see why you wouldn't do that. So yeah, I just wanted to make a point about the relevancy of the Open Cup now. So sorry about that. So no, Charlie, or Jeremy, go ahead. Sorry.
No, Chris, you're good. Because I think even going a step further on that, it's not just the fans. Like if you think about it, you're one of these players, right? On one of these lower league teams. If you get on a big stage and get exposure, like that elevates your career too. So it's not just about, not disrespecting ourselves as fans, because we're going to be there losing our voices anyway. But as putting myself in a player's shoes, I'm going to care because this is my audition to show another team at a higher level what I can do, whether there's 2,000 people in the stands or 20,000, whether it's in Minnesota on frozen land or down in Florida in the sunshine or somewhere in between. That to me is it's just an amazing thing that gets overlooked as well. In my opinion, when it comes to the Open Cup,
you never know who's watching.
Yeah.
Right? You never know who you can, you know, make an impact in front of.
You never know. Maybe a 38-year-old Bundesliga 2 player plays in it, and Lutz is like, "Wow, we need to sign this guy." No, I'm just joking, but I mean, the importance of that exposure is unrivaled, and I think the people, like you said, honestly, you didn't say it, but I'm gonna go out right and say people who say they don't like the Open Cup, I think they're a little selfish because you're saying, well, I don't like to watch it, but you know, I don't like to watch it, and that means it's bad. Like, you know, you're talking about, like you said, it matters to Union Omaha. It matters to the Pittsburgh USL team. It matters to these teams, especially even if they lose to some of the bigger MLS teams. They're talking about playing them on national TV. Yeah, I think that's really cool.
Yeah, revenue for them too, to help bolster their club as well. It might not be a lot, but anything to them might be huge, right? I mean, for us, maybe we're thinking dropping the bucket. But
and it's not, you know, Jeremy, you brought up the money for winning it. That's not the point. You know, the money obviously is nice. Every little bit helps, but the access into CONCACAF Champions Cup is so much better or so much bigger than the money part of it, right? And so that's the one thing when you have people who are like, I don't care about this tournament, who cares? You know, that's the one thing I'm like, well, this is a doorway into a gigantic tournament that is a big deal. Why would you not want to take this seriously? Why would you not want to try to put your best foot forward and see if you can qualify for it, right? And it's a heck of a lot easier to win the Open Cup than it is to win MLS Cup or win the Supporter Shield. Because Supporter Shield, you got to be good all year. And in the playoffs, you never know what the heck's going to happen in the playoffs. And you know, that's always a crapshoot anyways. But you have to get to the playoffs based on a good regular season. And then you have to play very well to get through the playoffs.
Yeah.
The Open Cup is the easier of the three methods to get into the Champions Cup. Of those three, it's the easiest one. You're talking about winning 4 games. So,
yeah, well, and to your point, if you win that, you get in that larger competition, that just makes you more attractive to attracting talent. Even if it's somebody in the later years of their career, the conversation about Kevin De Bruyne might not be Chicago. It might be, hey, he might come to St. Louis because they're a perennial contender. They're always in this competition. It's something to help you attract talent. And the only reason I brought up money is it's at least an increase. I think last year was $250K. This year it's up to $600.
You know, they're trying to do what they can. You know, and they're trying to stave off the influence of the overwhelming influence of MLS, who wants to get rid of this tournament. They would be rid of it in a second if they could be, if they could snap their fingers and just say we're done with it completely, they would. Which is why those of us who are so passionate about it feel like, we have to keep speaking up and keep making our voices heard and keep saying, hey, it matters to us. And we want to be in this tournament and we want to play in it and continue the tradition that we have. And and Charlie, not to, sorry, I sidetracked you from your question.
No, you're good.
Tomorrow night's game, but it's talking about the game specifically. I think it's going to be very, very, very interesting to see. We're going to see probably within the first 15 or 20 minutes if these players want to play for Olaf Malberg anymore. Because if they come out as dead and lifeless as they did last Saturday, then that means they have no interest in continuing to play for him. If they come out fired up and they're on the front foot and they're, creating chances and being aggressive, then, okay, that tells me that they're motivated to try to win a game. Whether they're trying to win it for him or whether they're trying to win it for themselves, they're at least motivated to try to win. But if they come out like they did Saturday and it just looks like they're going through the motions, that tells me that locker room has no interest in continuing to have him as the coach. Now, do I think that if they lose, that Melberg's going to get fired? I don't. I really don't, because I think it's going to take a combination of them losing tomorrow and Saturday. I think that's the combo that I think that ultimately would lead to his dismissal, because you can look at it and say, okay, the Open Cup, whatever happens, and it's it can be a weird situation in that game. But if you go another MLS game of 0 points or not getting a win, then I think that combined with a failure to advance in the Open Cup, I think that's got to be it, right? And I'm not rooting for that. People want to talk about, the organization and what our kind of, philosophy is from City. You can't dismiss 2 managers in less than 11 months.
Nope.
Right. That really is not a good look.
I think
go ahead.
If you do, and I think the smartest decision, I think there's a couple of reasons why that Olaf Malberg has this job. It's because you cannot sack 2 managers in 11 months. That's just not a good look for your team. Or they are waiting to, and in talks with another coach to not have an interim like John Hackworth again, because it'd be odd and kind of awkward to have John Hackworth coach the team for half a season and then go back to his position again. Either I think if you give John the position, you give John the position. But
I agree. I think that it would be strange to have him kind of be the permanent bridge. Temporary, the relief pitcher, the guy you bring in off the bench, that would be strange to have that happen again. Whether who knows if he would be even want to do it. He didn't get the job. And initially, he always stated he wanted to be, kind of in the technical director role that he had. Then the coaching thing kind of got him back into, hey, maybe I want to coach. Yeah. He winds up not getting the job. Now, would you even want to deal with it, or would you want to say, hey, you didn't want me, 6 months ago, find somebody else to be the interim again, So
then you look at Azrudin Valentic, who, was picked up on Olaf's staff after 3 months in a Danish league while getting his coaching license. I don't know if that's a better option, because he was the pilot of that collapse against Kansas City.
Yeah, there's names that have been thrown out, and I don't want to speculate obviously too much and get into what ifs. The one that I think people need to pump the brakes on is Jim Curtin. He is a phenomenal coach. Taylor Twellman told me on X over the weekend that they didn't even call him in the offseason, which is shocking to me. I think with a guy like that, you at least can make a phone call to say, are you interested at all? But Twellman said, no, they didn't even reach out to him, which you can get into what that means or, whether that's right or wrong. But to me, he is the perfect candidate for whatever team that goes into the playoffs with high expectations that then flames out and gets rid of their guy, he's the first call, right? So because it's going to happen, because every year somebody goes into the playoffs with high expectations and they get bounced in the first round, and then they get rid of their coach. And Jim Curtin's sitting there, and he can parachute in and take that, whatever club it is, and they're a ready-made contender, right? And so why he would ever want to come to this situation, and look at a club again that we just talked about, would have then dismissed 2 coaches in 11 months, is seemingly all over the place when it comes to what direction we're supposed to be going. Yeah, I think pump the brakes on that. But who knows? And I don't want to get into what coaches, because we have a coach, and we have a coach right now, and he's still the coach. So
and like, frankly, I hate to say it this way too, we all have our own reservations and thoughts about what's going on between Olaf and Diego and our roster composition. But if you sack Melberg now, I mean, that's just a terrible indictment against you in terms of identifying coaches, because that is just a blatant, we got it wrong, and we got it so wrong we're pivoting after 15 games, like, or whatever count we're at that point. So I don't know, that just makes this it just is a terrible look. And I don't know.
Well, I'm curious, and we're never going to know.
No.
But and I had mentioned something earlier in the week about it. I'm really curious to know that what those interviews were like, and were they sold something, or were they, sold a bill of goods on this guy that turned out to be not the case, because what were we told as fans? We were told that this coach was coming over that had no attachment to a particular style of play, that had no formational bias, that could adapt, his players to whatever style fit them the best. And all of that sounds great. And we were all kind of like, yeah, that sounds great. Carnell's, the biggest knock on Carnell was that, hey, guess what? We're playing a 4-4-2 and we're pressing. And if that doesn't work for 20 minutes, then we have no plan B, right? That was the biggest issue with Carnell. So we were sold this bill of goods on that guy who could seemingly, he can adapt. He can play multiple different formations, blah, blah, blah. And we've seen exactly the opposite of that, right? We've seen a guy who every week has thrown out basically 3 in the back, 2 wing backs, this ultra defensive system. And just similar to last year, when you have no offense and you can't threaten teams, they can continue to play higher and higher up the field against you and force you back and back and back. And you can't defend the goal for 80 minutes. It's not feasible. No. And so we haven't seen anything that we were told that are the strengths of this coach. And yes, you can point directly and say, okay, he doesn't have his full squad. There's a lot of injuries, blah, blah, blah. That's, and that's the case, right? That's true. But what we haven't seen is him willing to adapt to a different style or a different formation to utilize the players that he does have access to. He's continually throwing out the same people in the same roles. And it's just, that's, I think, where the biggest frustration is we don't have a discernible style right now. We don't have a direction that the club is I can't tell you what style they play, right? You can look at good clubs, and you can look at Columbus, and you can look at Seattle, the probably the best 2 coaches in the league, right? Wilfred Nancy and Brian Schmetzer. How those clubs are going to play. You can look at Vancouver right now, and what style they're going to play, right? You look at the Red Bulls, and all good clubs, you can identify in a sentence or 2, here's how they play. I dare you guys to tell me how City plays other than just pack it in defensively, right?
I got you. All right, 1 sentence or 2 sentences, you said?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. Sit back, counterattack. So I would say City's idea of their style of play would be to high press early, after 15 minutes, low block, and then hope for a prayer on a cross. That's what City is seeming to do recently.
Yeah. Chris, you stole my question because I was going to ask you what our style was.
Yeah.
But
no, and that's the biggest problem is they don't have a style, and I had sent something on social media that got quite a response from people, and that we don't have an identity as a club.
No,
we don't have an identity as a group of players, and we don't have a style that we play. And we talked about the St. Louis style being, super physical and in your face, all that stuff. And like I said, there's nothing that says City has to play like that, right? The regionalism that can unfortunately happen in St. Louis sometimes, where we want, bring back the Cardinals teams of the 80s and steal out of bases. That's not the way baseball's played anymore, right?
No.
And there's a lot of that sometimes in this town, where the good old days are better than anything we have now. But there is no obligation for City to play the traditional style of St. Louis soccer.
Yeah.
Okay. But when you're doing kind of nothing and it doesn't work, then people are going to point and say, well, why don't you try the style that we like, or that we're used to seeing, or that we grew up playing? Right. And that was something I heard in the beginning of year one was, okay, we're going to play a high press with Carnell. That's not the typical traditional style of St. Louis soccer. But if it works, people will be fine with it. But when it doesn't work, then people are going to say, well, why are you doing this?
Yeah.
And that's what happens.
Go ahead, Charlie.
I think we could all agree that we're at a giant fork in the road in City SC's history right now. This upcoming game on Wednesday, not only is it important in the regards and the context of what we just talked about for 51 minutes regarding the U.S. Open Cup and the history behind it and the importance behind it, not only because it continues the culture, not just because of the money prize, not just because of the ticket to the CONCACAF Cup if you win it, but just the tradition of being able to say, I played in the U.S. Open Cup. Being able to say, I played in the same tournament that, I heard stories about from my grandparents, right? I think that is an abundantly important thing. And especially in especially, because that would be important by itself, just playing in a U.S. Open Cup game, being able to make it to the round that they're in right now. But also to say that your coach is I can say what I don't know. We can't say definitively whether any change will be made, but I think most people will agree that his seat is pretty darn hot right now. I think that's something that's pretty well known. To have a coach in the hot seat to play in this historic tournament against a team you just lost to and got your butt whooped for 90 plus minutes on 5-6 days before that. I think it'll be kind of the ideal news headline this game. I mean, you're talking about everything I just said, plus you get to see some of the guys. You see some of the guys you won't see in MLS play. You had Joseph Zielinski, of course, is a little injured right now with a swollen ankle, apparently suffered after a game. But you talk about Joseph Zielinski and his him getting a shot in the U.S. Open Cup game versus Union Omaha and scoring and kind of propelling his putting his name in the hat for a guy to get minutes in MLS fixtures. I think that's something to be excited for in its own right.
Well, as you head into the game, the one thing that I'm going to be really curious to see, regardless of, I do agree we've got to probably run out as strong of a starting 11 as possible. The bench is going to be what I'm interested to see because, especially against Minnesota last weekend, we didn't have any center backs on the bench outside of Kessler, who was probably on a minutes restriction. So I'm going to be curious to see what City does, because as much as I want to see some of our first, like an Alm probably on the bench or something like that, I would almost rather see Miggy or somebody who's game fit, can come in and make a difference and is in good form, not just because of the good form and I have faith in them, but because if you don't put players on the bench that can impact the game outside of a 15-minute window, you are handicapping yourself and handcuffing yourself in a way. And that's one of my biggest issues with Mellberg and the way he's built his rosters on game day is the mismanagement of his bench, in my opinion. And so I'm going to be very curious to see who's on the bench tomorrow night.
I'd like to see a guy like Tyson Pierce get a nod on the bench. I think that'd be nice because, again, he's game fit, he's game ready, and I'm excited because the more dynamic you are able to be in that back line or even at a wing back position, the better, because you're so transition dependent.
I think when it comes to the composition of the team tomorrow, I think Jeremy, you make kind of a good point, which is, or you make a good point, which is, it'll be interesting to see what what the bench looks like, not necessarily the starters, but it will also tell us what Melberg's personal comfort level with his own job security is, right? Because if he rolls a bench out that's got a Tyson Pierce on it, or some two guys, if he rolls a bench out that's got Miggy Perez on it, or some of these guys who have not played basically for City this year, then to me that's a guy who's not really fearful of his job if he loses, right?
Great point.
But if his bench is all your normal regular City guys, and he rolls a lineup out that's all regular City starters, then that's a guy who's like, I need to win now, or else I may not be here for Saturday. I think, like I said, it's going to be really, really, really interesting to see not only how they play, are they interested in playing for him, and are they, on the front foot, but also the makeup of the team tomorrow, I think is going to be really kind of telling how he feels, because, ultimately the bench and the starters are his decision, right? That's his, he has control over who's on the roster for the game day. So if he rolls out a lineup and a bench that has like no City 2 guys on it, he's worried for his job. He's trying to say, hey, I got to win. If it's the other way around and there's a bunch of guys on there that you're like, oh, okay, yeah, that's cool, he's getting a call up, then he must have been told something by somebody that, hey, even if you lose, you're not in danger of going.
Yeah, that's I didn't think of that.
And so that'll be kind of what I take from it whenever I see the lineup is, does he feel like his job's at risk? And there has to be, something obviously with all the rumors, with all the, then again, how much of that is just rumor? How much of that has actually been confirmed by anybody at the club? Not much. It's a lot of fan talk, but I mean, other than that, we haven't had the famous, which is always the kiss of death. We haven't had the famous, endorsement from management saying, oh yeah, he's our guy. And then 2 days later he's gone. That tends to be how it works. But, so yeah, I think tomorrow's lineups will be really interesting. Not only with the starters, but also the bench.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much importance and so much relevance in this game, talking about things that are happening off the pitch, but even on the pitch. It's going to be 90 minutes of soccer that I'm excited to watch, that I think, that I hope, most people watching this right now, if not all, will be excited to watch and will watch if able, right?
Well, and also they should be in a position to take the game far more seriously than Minnesota is.
Yeah. This is a practice to Minnesota, basically.
Yes.
Because Minnesota doesn't have much history behind this. Minnesota is really coming into this game as this is an exhibition match.
Well, they're
second. They do have a little bit, that they did knock out St. Louis FC a couple years, out of this tournament back when they were in NASL squad. So there is a little bit of Open Cup history between these two cities. And so that's not, anything that's really that big of a deal, but there is a little bit of a history between these two cities.
Yeah.
Not like St. Louis had with a Louisville or a Cincinnati or anything like that. But
no.
So just want to throw that out there.
No, but I mean, the Loons are second in the West. I think they're they're fifth right now in the Supporter Shield race. So, I mean, the fact is they've got serious aspirations of MLS Cup dreams right now. So maybe to your points, this is not going to be something they take as seriously. Now, I will say this: I don't think their lineup is going to be as rotated as it was against Louisville City when they won 1-0 in the round of 32. When the only the only starter they ran out was Julian Gressel, I think, in that game, who will probably start tomorrow because he came on as a 78th minute sub at the weekend. But I still think this is an opportunity for City to come out and do something positive. So with that, do we want to get into predictions before we wrap up?
I think, honestly, I was going to say my prediction to I forgot. Never mind. I was going to say my prediction for the content charity challenge, but that's only for MLS season games.
It's only MLS.
Let's go in for it. I mean, I'll start off real quick and just say this is the biggest game of the season so far. I don't care if it's Open Cup. I don't care if this is Leagues Cup. I don't care what game this is. the situation that you were going to this game with, it is the most important game of the season. Every game is the most important game of the season going into this because of the dire situation you put yourself into. Your back's against the wall, this situation. The fate of your future of the club could be dependent in this. If they lose like 3-0 or 4-0, there's no doubt in my mind that Olaf Melberg's probably not going to be here much longer. So this game is of utmost importance, and I think it's a toss-up for me because, again, like you said, Chris, the first 15 minutes are going to be a huge dictator to how they're going to play. If they come out playing with a spark like they want to play under Olaf Melberg, I think they're going to win. If they don't and they feel sluggish like they did on Saturday, I don't think they pull out a win. But with that being said, I say I like to err on the side of optimism. I'm going to say the City SC scores 2 goals and that City SC wins 2-1 versus Minnesota United in Minnesota in this U.S. Open Cup game and advances to the round of 8.
Chris, what have you got, or what are your thoughts?
It's kind of similar to what Charlie said. I think, again, who knows what you're going to see? like we talked about, we could see a team that is completely given up on their boss and wants him out and comes out and just doesn't show any kind of fire at all. In which case you're probably looking at like a 2-0 loss. If they come out and they're on the front foot and they play well, are we that convinced that all of a sudden, they're going to roll 2 or 3 or 4 goals on a team? They haven't really shown the ability to do that all year. Mm-hmm. So my thought is, if I had to back to the wall and make a bet, I'd say something probably like a 1-1 and you're going to PKs, and then there, from there you're flipping a coin.
Yeah.
So and that frankly wouldn't surprise me one bit if it winds up a draw and then they wind up in a shootout. So yeah. I'll say 1-1.
So I'm going to give my prediction, but first I have one prevailing thought that I about this tournament. And it's that I hate the way the MLS has kind of positioned this to be the conference league of American soccer, right? Where you are the 3rd tier tournament, you're that lesser competition, and I hate it. And I'm hopeful that eventually we get to the point where it's all 32 teams again in the tournament, or all 30 MLS clubs. That's the thing, is I don't think the protest or what you want to call it now should end until we have all the teams from the MLS back in it. But as far as tomorrow goes, gentlemen, the prediction, I'm going to be watching the body language of the players. That I think will also be really telling because, they say they're together as a locker room. If they're, very expressive towards each other in negative ways or anything like that, that I think will be telling as where we are as a team. If I'm going to be optimistic, 1-1 with a win in PKs. I don't see us going out and lighting the pitch on fire. And I don't see us blowing out Minnesota. We've struggled to score all season. I don't think it gets any different here. So 1-1, and what the hell, we win in penalties with Roman Berkey coming up big.
Never know. You never know.
Shouldn't bet on that, probably.
I'll just say this, Chris. I think just myself. And the guys at Top Corner. I'm not going to speak for Jeremy because I guarantee Jeremy's going to say something after this. That's going to be much better than this. But thank you for coming on. I mean, this is
no problem.
The insight to hear from you, and I think not only from me and Jeremy, but the fans and the people in the chat right now hearing what we're saying. I think it's not going to go unnoticed, and I just want to say thank you for coming on, man.
No problem. Yeah, and again, it's not me dropping my own knowledge. It's me passing along stuff that I've learned from other people, and like I said, go read Dave Lang's book. I I have 2 copies myself. I read it, every few months because it's fascinating. And it really tells the story of our city and this game that we all love so much and why we became, the soccer city that we are. Go read Dave Lang's book. There's a reason that I have a history section on the website, and it has articles and videos and it's all stuff related to St. Louis soccer, because if I can share that information with people and keep those stories going and keep people talking about the history of the game here, and then we're adding to it with City now, then that's all I want to do. And so a chance I have to any chance I have to come on a show like your guys's and talk and talk soccer and City very very much appreciative of the chance to come and chat with you guys. So
yeah.
And Chris, again, from like Charlie said, thank you. We talked early in the show, about me, you don't do your own pod or anything like that, but I want you to know, at least from me, that you make a tremendous impact in this community and on this community through what you do on your site. So I would like you to please plug your socials, plug your site again, so that we can definitely get that information out to anyone that's listening, whether it's now or on the podcast recording later.
Well, again, thanks. Thank you guys so much for having me. And this has been nice to have a platform to talk US Open Cup, and why it matters and why it's important and why I think people should, at least show respect for it, whether they care to watch it or not, or whether they have interest or not. Just respect what it has meant to the city of St. Louis as far as the soccer culture here. As far as the website, like I said, it's stlsoccernews.com. And again, it's nothing of mine. It's a grand total of zero me on that website. I don't write, I don't contribute to it. I don't have my own podcast. I want to feature everybody else who's putting in the hard work like you guys do, and writers and podcasters and YouTubers, and I know we're all friends with Tom, and I love what he's doing and featuring, lower level soccer, because it's something I'm passionate about as well. And so, so it's STL Soccer News is the website. And then Blue Sky, it's STL Soccer News, and on X, it's STL_soccer_news. So the socials are, something that I'm not a super fan of, but it's a good way to just interact and connect with people. And if I can point and link to history or link to things I feel are important for people to know about soccer in the area, whether it's a new podcast coming out or, a game that's being played, or, really the thing that I think the website's gotten the most advertisement about is the unified schedule. And that's something that I think is really cool, is it's one place to go for basically all the soccer that's happening, in St. Louis. So from college games to semi-pro to next pro to MLS, like it's all in one spot. And it's a lot of work. And I'll give a shout out to the St. Louis Soccer Tracker guys, Brian Simpson, David Simpson, who do amazing stuff with theirs. And they also have a calendar as well. And so there's multiple people who are kind of doing the same thing, which is great. The more attention we can bring to soccer in the area, it's always a positive. And I would be remiss. I always try to call out and shout out the one guy who I like to pay tribute to is a guy named Steve Olson. Steve Olson was kind of the OG when it came to promoting the game in St. Louis and going to 1 million games, and always at high school and semi-pro. And Steve passed away a few years ago, and right before we got City, and he was a guy that I'm a hundredth of what he was and what he meant to St. Louis as a soccer town. And so anything that I can do to even, contribute in my little small way to pay tribute to him and what he did is always something I'll try to do. So sorry to ramble on, but I appreciate again the invite. This has been really cool to talk to you guys. So
make sure you guys go follow him, follow what he does. Chris, it does amazing stuff for the game of soccer in St. Louis. Even if like he's not gonna ramble and he's not gonna be like give himself a pat in the back, be like I do all this. He is keeping that site running. He is making that schedule. He like I said, it puts a tremendous amount of work. He's promoting these platforms, and I think that's something that none of us could do right now. I think that's something that is needed. And is something that that I think I would say the wide majority of St. Louis soccer fans are grateful for. So, on my behalf, I want to say thank you again for coming on. Jeremy, any final thoughts?
No, here's hoping for a surprise tomorrow and a positive result and advancing on. I mean, this is so far the deepest run in the Open Cup in our club history. So here's hoping it continues. And again, Chris, can't say thank you enough. I'm happy to have met you out on Luligan Street. I'm happy for the friendship, and I'm happy for what you do to help me be a better fan. Because again, through your site, man, I've made many connections across the MLS media world, and I'm grateful for it, man. So thank you, and thanks for coming on tonight. I appreciate your time.
Yeah,
no problem, guys. Anytime.
All right, y'all. Tomorrow, watch along for the Open Cup game we talked about all night tonight for an hour and 10 minutes. A special episode having our first guest that hasn't become a unified member, because we had Jeremy on a couple times, and then we were just like, heck, we got to get this guy in, I guess. But, you know, the way that we're rolling right now, you're going to get a lot of special episodes. You'll get one. You had one on Monday, of course. You had one today. You're going to have one tomorrow, watch along. And we might do something soon. Something, you know, something nice for the fans and something like that. Make sure to check out Chris and everything he does. STLsoccernews.com. On, you know, almost every social, like you said, Blue Sky and X. Check out Jeremy. Check out me if you want to. Just put a new article on youthsmedia.com. Check that out. Youths, they do great stuff. Drew Young, shout out Drew. He's a cool guy with great photographer, great producer in that sense. But have a good night, y'all. Let's go City. I'm gonna go watch some hockey. But have a good one, y'all. Thank you. Adios.